There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from starting over too many times. You've felt it before, that weariness that settles in when you realize you're beginning again at square one, when the momentum you built last week has vanished like morning fog, when the version of yourself who made that promise or set that intention feels like a stranger you barely recognize. This isn't a book about working harder. It's not another call to push through pain or ignore your limits or sacrifice everything at the altar of achievement. We've had enough of those conversations, and more importantly, you've lived through enough of their consequences to know they don't lead where they promise. Instead, this is an exploration of something far more sustainable and, paradoxically, far more powerful: the psychology of consistency. Not consistency as relentless grinding, but consistency as a form of self-knowledge. Not winning as domination, but winning as the quiet accumulation of days lived in alignment with who you actually are. The distinction matters more than you might think. Consider for a moment the pattern that has likely repeated itself in your life more than once. You decide to change something. The decision feels real, urgent, necessary. You might even experience that electric clarity that comes with genuine commitment. For days, perhaps weeks, you follow through. You show up. You do the work. And then gradually or suddenly, you don't. The streak breaks. The routine dissolves, and what remains is not just the absence of the habit, but a quiet erosion of trust in your own word to yourself. This pattern is so common, it's almost universal, yet we treat each occurrence as a personal failure rather than as data about how human beings actually function. We assume the problem is our willpower, our discipline, our character. We look at people who seem to maintain consistency effortlessly and imagine they possess some quality we lack, some genetic advantage or childhood teaching we missed. But that's not what's happening. What looks like effortless consistency is almost always the result of understanding something deeper about how sustainable behavior actually works. It's the difference between forcing yourself to run on a broken leg and learning to walk in a way that doesn't create injury in the first place. The people who win every day without burning out aren't superhuman. They've simply learned to work with their psychology rather than against it. They've discovered that consistency isn't about overpowering your resistance. It's about removing the conditions that create resistance in the first place. Think about the last time you maintained something consistently for months or even years without it feeling like a constant battle. Perhaps it's how you care for someone you love, or a morning ritual so integrated into your life you'd feel strange without it, or the way you naturally gravitate towards certain activities when you have free time. In those areas, consistency isn't hard. It's simply what happens when behavior aligns with identity, when action matches authentic desire, when the structure of your life supports rather than sabotages what matters to you. This reveals something crucial. The problem is rarely that you lack the capacity for consistency. You demonstrate it constantly in dozens of areas. The problem is that you've been trying to force consistency in ways that violate how you actually function as a human being. You've been taught to see consistency as a matter of rigid adherence to predetermined rules. Do this thing at this time in this way every single day, no matter what. Any deviation is failure. Any flexibility is weakness. Any adjustment is evidence that you're not serious enough, committed enough, disciplined enough. This approach works beautifully for machines. For humans, it's a setup for the exact cycle of enthusiasm and collapse you've experienced so many times before. The alternative isn't chaos or lack of structure. It's not permission to abandon every commitment the moment it becomes inconvenient. It's something more sophisticated, building consistency on a foundation of psychological truth rather than idealized fantasy. Your mind and body aren't obstacles to overcome. They're the instruments through which any lasting change must flow. When you understand how they actually work, when you design your commitments around psychological reality rather than against it, consistency stops being a constant fight and becomes something closer to a natural rhythm. This matters now more than ever because we live in a culture of unsustainable intensity. Everywhere you look, someone is telling you to wake up earlier, work harder, optimize more, push faster. Rest is rebranded as recovery for the sole purpose of enabling more output. Balance is treated as a myth or a luxury, and burning out is framed as the price of success, the badge of honor that proves you're serious about your life. Meanwhile, actually successful people, the ones who sustain high performance across years and decades, who build meaningful work and relationships that last, who remain energized rather than depleted by their own ambitions, tend to operate very differently. They've learned that intensity is a tool to be applied strategically, not a constant state to maintain. They understand that sustainable winning doesn't come from daily heroisms, but from boring reliability in the fundamentals. They've discovered that you don't need to be exceptional every day. You just need to be present, engaged, and moving in the right direction. The exceptional results come from the compound effect of that simple presence sustained over time. But here's what makes this truly psychological rather than purely tactical. The shift required isn't primarily about what you do, it's about how you see yourself, how you relate to your own patterns, how you interpret the inevitable moments when things don't go according to plan. The person who burns out and the person who sustains might follow similar routines on any given day. The difference shows up in how they respond when life disrupts the routine, when motivation wanes, when results don't come as quickly as expected. One treats these as catastrophes that invalidate everything. The other treats them as information that informs adjustment. One judges themselves harshly for being human. The other expects to be human and plans accordingly. This shift in perspective, from seeing consistency as rigid perfection to seeing it as flexible persistence, from treating yourself as a machine to be programmed to recognizing yourself as a living system with patterns and needs. This is the psychological foundation that makes winning every day possible without destroying yourself in the process. You already know what happens without this foundation. You've lived through the cycles enough times. The initial burst of motivation, the unsustainable intensity, the inevitable collapse, the guilt and shame, the eventual rebuilding only to repeat the same pattern. Each cycle takes a little more from you. Each failure to maintain consistency erodes your self-trust a bit further. What you might not yet know is what becomes possible when you build differently from the start. When you design your life around sustainability rather than intensity, something interesting happens. The dramatic peaks and valleys flatten into something steadier. Progress becomes less exciting in any single moment, but far more reliable across time. And gradually, without quite noticing when it shifted, you stop living in reaction to motivation and start living from something more stable, a sense of identity aligned with your daily actions. You stop needing to psych yourself up for every session, every task, every moment of effort. You stop negotiating with yourself about whether today counts or tomorrow would be better. You simply show up, not because you've mastered some superhuman discipline, but because showing up is what someone like you does. This is where real consistency lives, not in white-knuckling through resistance, but in becoming the kind of person for whom the desired action is simply normal. The question this book explores, then, isn't how to force yourself into consistency through sheer will. It's how to become someone for whom consistency in the areas that matter is as natural as breathing. How to align your daily reality with your deeper values so thoroughly that resistance dissolves, not because you've overcome it, but because you've removed the misalignment that created it. The journey from where you are to where that becomes true involves understanding some specific things about how human psychology actually works, about why most approaches to building habits fail, about what creates the conditions for sustainable change versus temporary willpower-driven sprints, about how to design a life structure that supports rather than sabotages your intentions. It involves getting honest about what consistency actually requires versus what you've been told it requires, about the difference between discipline and self-punishment, about how to set goals that energize you rather than deplete you, about when to push and when to rest, and how to tell the difference. Most of all, it involves developing a different relationship with yourself, one based on understanding and working with your actual patterns, rather than constantly judging yourself for not matching an idealized version that was never realistic in the first place. This isn't easy work, but it's simpler than you might think. Simple in the sense that it doesn't require complex systems or sophisticated tactics. The principles are straightforward, but simple doesn't mean easy, because applying these principles requires you to let go of stories you've been telling yourself for years about what it means to be disciplined, successful, worthy. It requires you to stop treating yourself as a problem to be solved and start seeing yourself as a system to be understood. The people who win every day without burning out have made this shift, not because they're different from you in some fundamental way, but because they've learned to work with their psychology rather than against it. They've discovered that the path to sustainable success isn't through more intensity, but through better alignment. And that's what we're here to explore together. Chapter 1: The Consistency Trap. Before we can build something sustainable, we need to understand why the usual approaches fail so predictably. Not because there's value in dwelling on failure, but because the patterns that have sabotaged you before contain crucial information about what to do differently. You've probably noticed that most advice about consistency follows a similar template. Identify your goal, break it into smaller steps, schedule it into your day, hold yourself accountable, track your progress, don't break the chain, just do it. This advice isn't wrong exactly. For certain personalities, in certain contexts, with certain goals, it works beautifully. But for most people, most of the time, it creates a specific kind of trap, one that feels like personal failure, but is actually a predictable outcome of a flawed approach. The trap works like this. You start with motivation. The goal matters to you. You can see clearly why it's important, how it will improve your life, what will become possible if you follow through. This clarity fuels your initial commitment. You create a plan. You announce it to yourself, maybe to others. You feel the satisfaction of having decided, of being the kind of person who takes action. The first days go well. You're running on the fumes of that initial decision. Each completion feels like evidence that this time is different, that you finally figured it out, that you've become the disciplined person you've always meant to be. And then the motivation fades, not dramatically, not in a way you can point to and say that's when it changed, just gradually, like fog rolling in. The action that felt energizing last week feels neutral this week. What was exciting becomes routine. What was routine becomes tedious. This is the first critical juncture, and it's where the standard advice tends to fail you, because what you've been told is that this is exactly when discipline takes over. Motivation gets you started, Discipline keeps you going. Don't rely on feelings, just execute the plan. And you try, you really do. You show up even when you don't feel like it. You override your resistance. You do the thing. And for a while, this works. You're proud of yourself for pushing through. You feel like you're developing real discipline. What happens next is almost inevitable. Life adds an extra stressor. Work gets more demanding. A relationship hits a rough patch. You get sick. Something disrupts your routine. And suddenly, the willpower you were using to maintain your habit is needed elsewhere. You can't afford to spend it on your morning routine when you need it to navigate an interpersonal conflict or meet an urgent deadline. The habit breaks. The streak ends. And because you've been operating on the discipline overcomes motivation model, you interpret this as a personal failure. You weren't disciplined enough. You weren't committed enough. If you really cared, you would have found a way. This interpretation has consequences. It doesn't just mean you stopped the habit. It means you've added another data point to your growing collection of evidence that you're not the kind of person who follows through, that you're not consistent, that you can't be trusted to keep your word to yourself. The emotional weight of this accumulates. Each broken streak becomes heavier than the last because it's not just about this habit, it's about every other time you failed to maintain consistency. It's about your fundamental identity as someone who starts strong and fades out. Eventually, you might stop trying altogether, at least for a while. What's the point of starting if you know you'll just quit? Why go through the cycle again? Better to accept that you're just not a consistent person than to keep proving it to yourself through repeated failure. This is the consistency trap. Not the failure to maintain a habit, but the psychological damage caused by the interpretation of that failure. The trap isn't in stopping, it's in what stopping means to you about who you are. And here's the crucial insight that makes escape possible. The entire trap is built on a misunderstanding of how sustainable consistency actually works. The discipline overcomes motivation model assumes that consistency is primarily a matter of willpower, that if you just develop enough mental toughness, you can override any resistance and maintain any behavior indefinitely. This assumption is so embedded in our cultural thinking that questioning it feels almost like making excuses. But it's wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Sustainable consistency doesn't come from developing unlimited willpower. It comes from reducing the need for willpower in the first place. It comes from designing your life so that the desired behavior is the path of least resistance rather than a constant uphill battle. Think about the things you do consistently without effort. You probably brush your teeth every day without having to psych yourself up about it. You likely feed yourself regularly without needing motivation. You charge your phone. You wear clothes that match the weather. You follow hundreds of routines and patterns without consuming any willpower at all. Why? Because these behaviors are fully integrated into your identity and your environment. They're not things you do, they're things that happen as a natural part of being you. The resistance has been eliminated not through stronger discipline, but through better design. This is the shift that changes everything. When you stop asking, how can I force myself to be consistent, and start asking, how can I become the kind of person for whom this behavior is natural, you're working with your psychology rather than against it. But this raises an important question. If willpower and discipline aren't the answer, what is? How do you actually become that person? How do you redesign your life to support rather than sabotage your intentions? The answer involves understanding several interconnected principles about how human behavior actually works, about identity and environment and feedback loops, and the role of emotion in sustainable change, about why small beats big, why flexible beats rigid, why identity beats outcome. Before we explore those principles, though, it's worth sitting with the recognition that the approach you've been using isn't working because there's something wrong with you. It's not working because it's based on a model of human psychology that's more aspirational than actual. You're not lacking discipline, you're lacking a system that accounts for how you actually function as a human being. The exhaustion you feel from starting over repeatedly isn't weakness, it's your system giving you feedback that the approach isn't sustainable. The resistance you experience when trying to maintain streaks through pure willpower isn't character failure, it's your psychology telling you something important about alignment and authenticity. What if instead of trying to overcome these signals, you listen to them? What if they contain information about how to build something that lasts? Chapter 2: The Architecture of Sustainable Change. There's a reason why certain changes stick effortlessly, while others require constant maintenance. It's not random, and it's not about the inherent difficulty of the behavior. It's about whether the change has been integrated into the deeper architecture of your life. To understand this architecture, imagine your daily existence as a building. The visible structure, your actions, your habits, your routines, that's what most people focus on when they try to change. They want to add a new room, remodel a space, install better features, and they approach it the way you might add furniture. Just put it where you want it and hope it stays. But a building isn't held together by furniture. It's held together by foundation, frame, and supports that you don't see, but that determine what remains standing and what collapses under pressure. Your life is the same way. The visible behaviors rest on invisible architecture: your identity, your environment, your relationships, your systems, your beliefs about yourself.
When you try to change a behavior without addressing this deeper architecture, you're essentially placing new furniture in a building with a cracked foundation. It might look good initially, it might even function for a while, but it's not stable. The first earthquake, the first major life stress, brings it all down. Sustainable consistency requires building from the foundation up. It requires making changes at the architectural level, not just the decorative one. This takes more thought up front, but it's the difference between change that requires constant maintenance and change that maintains itself. Let's start with the deepest level: identity. Every action you take is, in some sense, a vote for the kind of person you believe yourself to be. When you go to the gym, you're casting a vote for being an athletic person. When you choose a salad over fast food, you're voting for being health conscious. When you show up to write even when you don't feel inspired, you're voting for being a writer. These votes accumulate. Over time, they form a pattern, and that pattern becomes your identity. Not the identity you claim to have or wish you had, but the one evidenced by your actual behavior. And here's what makes this crucial for consistency. Once a behavior becomes part of your identity, maintaining it stops being a matter of willpower and becomes a matter of self-expression. You don't need discipline to be yourself. You just are yourself, naturally, automatically. This is why identity-based change is so much more sustainable than outcome-based or behavior-based change. If your goal is to lose 20 pounds, you're focused on an outcome. You might maintain the necessary behaviors until you reach that outcome, but once you do, the motivation disappears. The behavior was never integrated into who you are. It was just a temporary means to an external end. If your goal is to go to the gym 5 times a week, you're focused on behavior. You might maintain it for a while, but it's always something you have to do rather than something you are. It sits on top of your identity rather than emerging from it. But if your goal is to become an athlete, to embody that identity, then going to the gym isn't something you force yourself to do. It's what athletes do. It's what you do because you're an athlete. The behavior flows naturally from the identity. This might sound like a subtle distinction, but it changes everything about the psychology of consistency. When behavior aligns with identity, you're not constantly fighting yourself. You're not having to convince yourself. You're simply being who you are. The question becomes, how do you shift identity? How do you become the person for whom the desired behavior is natural?
The answer is counterintuitive. You don't shift identity and then change behavior. You change behavior and thereby shift identity. The votes come first. The identity emerges from the pattern of votes. But, and this is crucial, the votes have to be authentic. You can't fake your way to identity change. If you're voting in ways that violate your actual values, your actual circumstances, your actual capacity, the pattern won't hold. Your psychology isn't that easily fooled. This is why sustainable consistency requires self-knowledge. You need to know who you actually are, not who you think you should be. You need to understand your natural rhythms, your genuine values, your real constraints. You need to design behaviors that fit the truth of your life, rather than some idealized version that exists only in your imagination. Someone who naturally has energy in the morning shouldn't force themselves into an evening workout routine just because that's what their friend does. Someone who processes emotions through writing shouldn't try to become someone who meditates in silence just because that's what they think disciplined people do. Someone who thrives on variety shouldn't lock themselves into rigid routines that leave no room for spontaneity. The goal isn't to become a different person, it's to become more fully yourself, with behaviors that align with, rather than contradict, your nature. This brings us to the second architectural element, environment. You are not a brain floating in a jar, making decisions in a vacuum. You're embedded in physical and social environments that shape your behavior far more than you probably realize. The people around you, the physical spaces you inhabit, the default options available to you, the friction involved in various choices, all of this influences what you do with far less conscious awareness than you might think. Most people dramatically underestimate the power of environment and dramatically overestimate the power of willpower. They try to maintain healthy eating habits while keeping junk food in easy reach. They try to focus deeply while their phone buzzes with notifications. They try to build creative practices while surrounded by people who mock creative ambition. And then they wonder why it's so hard. They blame themselves for lacking discipline, when the real problem is that they're trying to swim upstream against environmental currents that are far stronger than their willpower could ever be. The solution isn't to develop superhuman willpower, it's to design your environment so that the desired behavior is easier than the undesired one. Make the good choice the default. Remove friction from what you want to do. Add friction to what you want to avoid. This is about being strategic rather than heroic. If you want to read more, put books in every room and your phone in a drawer. If you want to eat healthier, don't keep tempting foods in your house. Make the friction of going to the store higher than the friction of eating what's available. If you want to write daily, have your writing space set up and ready so that starting requires zero preparation. Environment design isn't cheating. It's working with human psychology as it actually exists, rather than as we wish it existed. It's recognizing that you are influenced by your surroundings and choosing to make those surroundings support rather than sabotage you. The same principle applies to social environment. You become like the people you spend time with. Their habits influence your habits. Their standards become your standards. Their possibilities shape your perception of what's possible. This doesn't mean you should abandon everyone who isn't perfectly aligned with your goals, but it does mean being intentional about who influences you, seeking out people who embody what you're trying to become, reducing exposure to those who reinforce patterns you're trying to change, creating or joining communities where your desired behavior is normal rather than exceptional. When you're surrounded by people who read, you read more. When you're around people who exercise, you exercise more. When you spend time with people who are building businesses or creating art or learning languages, those activities stop seeming like distant aspirations and start seeming like things people just do. Your environment, both physical and social, should make the desired behavior the path of least resistance. When it does, consistency stops requiring heroic effort and starts happening naturally. The third architectural element is systems. A system is different from a goal. A goal is a specific outcome you want to achieve. A system is a process you commit to regardless of outcomes. Goals are about destinations. Systems are about directions. The problem with goal-focused thinking is that it creates a binary state. You've either achieved the goal or you haven't. Until you reach it, you're failing. Once you reach it, the motivation disappears. Goals are helpful for setting direction, but they're terrible foundations for sustainable consistency. Systems thinking shifts this entirely. Instead of, I want to lose 20 pounds, you think, I'm someone who moves my body daily and eats mostly whole foods. Instead of, I want to write a book, you think, I'm someone who writes for an hour each morning. Instead of, I want to build a business that makes 6 figures, you think, I'm someone who ships work consistently and improves my skills daily. Notice how systems thinking connects directly to identity. You're not chasing an outcome, you're embodying a process. You're becoming someone who does certain things regardless of specific results. This creates a very different relationship with consistency. In goal-focused thinking, any day you don't make measurable progress toward the outcome feels like failure. In systems thinking, any day you honor the system is a success, regardless of visible results. This matters because results are often delayed, non-linear, and partially outside your control. If your sense of success depends on seeing results, you'll lose motivation during the inevitable plateaus. But if your sense of success comes from honoring your system, you can feel good about your consistency even when results aren't yet visible. Over time, the person who focuses on systems outperforms the person who focuses on goals. Not because systems are more ambitious, but because they're more sustainable. The goal-focused person works intensely when motivated and stops when results plateau. The systems-focused person just keeps showing up, accumulating small improvements that compound into significant change. But for a system to be sustainable, it has to be designed well. It can't be so ambitious that it requires perfect conditions. It can't be so rigid that it breaks the first time life gets messy. It has to have flexibility built in, room for the reality of human variation. This is where most people get it wrong. They design systems for an idealized future version of themselves, rather than for who they actually are right now. They create elaborate morning routines that require waking at 5 a.m., meditating for 30 minutes, journaling for 20, exercising for an hour, and then they wonder why they can't maintain it. A good system starts small enough that you can do it on your worst day. Not your average day, your worst day. The day you're sick, stressed, exhausted, overwhelmed. If your system collapses the moment life gets hard, it's not a system, it's a fair weather aspiration. This doesn't mean you can't expand the system over time, but expansion should come from capacity, not ambition, from genuine increases in your ability to maintain something, not from wishes about who you think you should be. Start with a version of the behavior so small it seems almost trivial. Want to become someone who exercises? Start with a single push-up. Want to become a writer? Start with one sentence. Want to meditate? Start with one breath. This might feel insufficient. Your ambitious mind will resist. Surely you need to do more than that to see results. But remember, the goal right now isn't results. It's building the identity, establishing the pattern, proving to yourself that you can be consistent. One push-up done every day teaches you that you're someone who exercises daily. That identity foundation is more valuable than the occasional intense workout followed by weeks of nothing. Once the identity is established, once the consistency is proven, you can build on it, but you build on foundation, not fantasy. The fourth architectural element is feedback. Behavior that goes unnoticed tends to fade. Behavior that gets reinforced tends to continue. This is basic psychology, but it's often overlooked in consistency design. You need mechanisms that help you notice when you're honoring your commitments and when you're not in a judgmental way, in an informational way. You need feedback loops that tell you whether your system is working, whether your environment is supporting you, whether your identity is shifting in the direction you intended.
This might be as simple as a physical token you move from one container to another each time you complete your action, or a calendar where you mark days you showed up, or a journal where you reflect briefly on what worked and what didn't. The specific mechanism matters less than the presence of some feedback that makes your consistency visible. Visibility serves two purposes. First, it reinforces the identity you're building. Each time you mark completion, you're telling yourself, "I'm the kind of person who does this." Second, it provides information about patterns. When you can see your consistency over time, you can notice what conditions support it and what conditions undermine it. Maybe you realize you're more consistent when you do the behavior first thing in the morning, or that you struggle on weekends when your routine is disrupted, or that you're more likely to follow through after spending time with certain people. This information is gold. It allows you to design better systems, adjust your environment, understand yourself more deeply. But feedback only works if you're willing to be honest about it. If you're judging yourself harshly for every miss, you'll start avoiding the feedback. You'll skip tracking on days you don't perform.
You'll make excuses. You'll lose the very information that would help you improve. This is why the relationship you have with yourself matters so much for sustainable consistency. If you're treating yourself like an employee you don't trust, constantly monitoring for failure and ready to punish any deviation, you'll create a psychological environment hostile to change. But if you're treating yourself like a collaborator you're genuinely curious about, interested in understanding rather than judging, the feedback becomes valuable rather than threatening. The architecture of sustainable change, identity, environment, systems, and feedback, these aren't separate elements, they're interconnected supports that hold each other up. Your identity influences what environments you seek out. Your environment shapes what systems are possible. Your systems generate feedback that reinforces or challenges your identity. When all four elements align, consistency becomes almost effortless, not because you've developed superhuman discipline, but because you've built a structure that makes the desired behavior natural.
When they're misaligned, even small changes require enormous effort because you're constantly fighting against the architecture of your own life. The work of building sustainable consistency, then, isn't primarily about forcing behavior. It's about aligning architecture. It's slower at first, requires more thought, demands more honesty about who you actually are versus who you think you should be. But it's the difference between building something that lasts and constantly starting over, between winning every day and burning out trying.
Chapter 3: The Practice of Showing Up. Understanding the architecture is one thing, living it is another. Between insight and implementation lies the messy territory of actual daily life, where theory meets reality, and where sustainable consistency is either built or abandoned. This is where most transformation efforts fail, not from lack of understanding, but from the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it consistently enough for it to matter. So let's talk about practice, about what it actually looks like to show up day after day in a way that builds rather than depletes you. The first thing to understand is that showing up doesn't mean performing at peak level every time. This is perhaps the most important distinction in the psychology of consistency, and it's one that most high achievers struggle with intensely. You've been conditioned to equate value with output, worth with achievement, showing up with producing results. This conditioning makes it almost impossible to show up in a sustainable way because it turns every session, every attempt, every moment of practice into a test you can either pass or fail. But sustainable consistency isn't about performing, it's about presence. It's about maintaining contact with the thing that matters to you even when you're not at your best, especially when you're not at your best. Consider what happens when you define showing up as producing excellent work. On days when you have energy, focus, and favorable conditions, you show up, you perform well, you feel good about yourself. But on days when you're tired, distracted, or dealing with life's normal challenges, you face a choice: show up and produce mediocre work, or skip it entirely. If mediocre work feels like failure, skipping becomes the more psychologically comfortable option. At least then you're not confronting evidence of your limitations. At least then you can tell yourself you would have done well if you'd tried. The perfectionist streak that drives high achievement becomes the very thing that prevents consistency. But here's what changes when you redefine showing up as simply maintaining contact. Mediocre work isn't failure, It's success. It's proof that you showed up. It counts just as much as excellent work, maybe more, because it's harder to do. It requires overriding the voice that says, if you can't do it well, don't do it at all. The writer who writes badly for 15 minutes has written. The athlete who does a light workout instead of an intense one has trained. The meditator who sits for 3 distracted minutes has meditated. They've maintained the identity, honored the system, cast their vote for who they are. And here's the paradox. When you release the requirement for excellence, you often end up producing more excellent work over time. Not because standards don't matter, but because you've removed the psychological barrier that prevented you from showing up on less than optimal days. You've increased your reps, your practice time, your contact hours with the thing you're trying to improve at.
The person who only shows up when they can perform excellently might have higher peaks, but they have massive gaps. The person who shows up regardless of performance level might have lower peaks on any given day, but they have consistency. And consistency, over time, produces results that intermittent excellence never achieves. This requires a fundamental shift in how you measure success, not by the quality of any single session, but by the pattern over time. Not by whether today's work was your best, but by whether you maintained contact with what matters. It also requires something that might feel uncomfortable, lowering your standards for showing up, while potentially raising your standards for what you're building toward over time. You want the barrier to entry to be low, so low you can't talk yourself out of it, but you want the long-term vision to be compelling enough to keep you engaged. Think of it this way. The minimum viable version of your practice should be so easy you can do it even on your worst day. 1 sentence, 1 minute, 1 rep, something that preserves the streak, maintains the identity, keeps the connection alive. But the practice itself, over time, should be in service of something meaningful enough that you want to keep showing up. This is the difference between empty habits and sustainable practices. An empty habit is something you do because you committed to it, but it's disconnected from any larger purpose. You're just maintaining the streak for the sake of the streak. A sustainable practice is something you do because it's building something you care about, and the minimum version exists to keep you connected during hard times, not as the permanent aspiration. The second element of showing up is understanding the role of rhythm over routine. Routines are specific, same time, same place, same sequence. They work beautifully when your life is stable and predictable, but most lives aren't. Most lives involve varying schedules, unexpected demands, travel, relationships, responsibilities that shift day to day. When you're rigidly attached to a specific routine and life disrupts it, you face a crisis. You can't do it the way you're supposed to, so you might not do it at all. The routine becomes brittle, and brittleness is the enemy of sustainability. Rhythm is different. Rhythm is about pattern and flow rather than precise timing. It's about maintaining the essence of the practice while allowing the form to flex with the demands of your life. A routine might be write for 90 minutes at your desk between 5 and 6:30 a.m. A rhythm might be connect with your writing every morning before other demands take over, whether that's 90 minutes at a desk or 10 minutes on your phone while waiting for coffee. See the difference? The routine requires specific conditions. The rhythm requires only commitment to the essence. The routine breaks when conditions change. the rhythm adapts while maintaining consistency. This is particularly important for people whose lives genuinely vary day to day. If you have young children, if you travel frequently, if you work irregular hours, if you're navigating chronic health conditions, trying to maintain rigid routines will make you feel like you're constantly failing. But rhythms can work even in chaos. The key is identifying what's essential to the practice versus what's just one possible form it can take. If you're building a meditation practice, the essence might be creating space for inner stillness. That can happen through 20 minutes of formal sitting, or through 3 minutes of breathing while standing in your kitchen, or through a walking meditation during your lunch break. If you're building a fitness practice, the essence might be moving your body intentionally. That can happen through a structured workout at a gym, or through a walk in your neighborhood, or through playing actively with your children, or through a stretching session in your living room. When you're clear on essence, you can maintain consistency across varying circumstances. When you're attached to specific form, you're one disruption away from losing the thread entirely. This doesn't mean form doesn't matter. There's value in having a default approach, a preferred structure, a routine you return to when conditions allow. But treating that routine as the only valid way to practice makes your consistency fragile. Building rhythm that can accommodate different forms makes it anti-fragile. It actually gets stronger through variation and adaptation. The third element is understanding the power of micro-commitments and the danger of overcommitment. There's a particular kind of enthusiasm that emerges at the beginning of any new commitment. You can see the vision clearly. You feel energized by possibility. You want to go all in immediately, intensely. You want to commit to the fullest version of the practice right from the start. This enthusiasm is valuable, but it's also dangerous because it leads to overcommitment. You promise yourself more than you can sustain. You design a system for the person you want to become rather than the person you are. And when you inevitably can't maintain that level of intensity, you interpret it as failure rather than as predictable human limitation. The alternative is to start with micro-commitments, promises so small they feel almost silly. Then you keep them consistently until they become effortless. Only then do you expand. This approach frustrates the ambitious mind. It feels slow. It seems like you should be able to commit to more. But it's working with a psychological truth. Trust in yourself is built through kept promises, especially small ones. Every time you do what you said you'd do, you're depositing into an account of self-trust. Every time you break a promise to yourself, you're making a withdrawal.
When your account of self-trust is depleted, it doesn't matter how ambitious your plans are, you won't believe you'll follow through, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling. But when your account is full, when you've proven to yourself that you keep your word, larger commitments become possible because they rest on a foundation of demonstrated reliability. So you start small, ridiculously small if necessary. You commit to 1 minute of meditation, 1 paragraph of writing, 1 lap around the block. You keep that commitment daily until it's automatic. Then you expand slightly. 2 minutes, 2 paragraphs, 2 laps. The expansion is gradual, organic, based on capacity rather than ambition. You're never pushing to the point of unsustainability. You're always maintaining a cushion, a buffer of ease that means you could do more, but you're choosing not to because you're prioritizing the long game over the sprint. This probably sounds conservative to the point of being ineffective, but consider, Would you rather commit to an hour of daily practice and maintain it 3 days a week with constant guilt about the other 4, or commit to 10 minutes daily and actually do it every single day, building an identity as someone who shows up consistently? The second approach creates less immediate output but more long-term capacity. It builds the psychological foundation that makes expansion possible. And interestingly, once you've established true consistency with a small commitment, you often find yourself naturally doing more than the minimum, simply because you're there, you're engaged, and why not continue? But the minimum remains the minimum. It's your anchor in storms. It's what you return to when life gets hard. It's what ensures you never lose the thread completely.
Chapter 4. Working with Resistance. Even with perfect architecture, even with well-designed systems and sustainable commitments, resistance will arise. This isn't a design flaw, it's a feature of being human. The question isn't how to eliminate resistance, but how to work with it skillfully. Most approaches to resistance treat it as an enemy to overcome. You feel resistance, you push through it. You prove you're stronger than your excuses. This works sometimes, particularly for acute challenges, but as a long-term strategy for daily consistency, it's exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. The alternative is to treat resistance as information. When you feel it, instead of immediately trying to override it, you pause and investigate. What is this resistance trying to tell you? Sometimes resistance is protective. Your body is tired and needs rest. Your mind is oversaturated and needs space. Your nervous system is dysregulated and needs gentleness. In these cases, pushing through isn't discipline, it's violence against yourself. And violence, even in the name of consistency, creates conditions for eventual collapse. The sustainable response to protective resistance is to honor it while maintaining contact with your commitment. Maybe you do the minimum version. Maybe you do something adjacent that serves the same deeper purpose. Maybe you genuinely rest, knowing that rest is part of the system, not a failure of the system. Other times, resistance is habitual. You've trained your brain to resist this particular thing at this particular time, and it's just running its familiar pattern. There's no deep wisdom in it, no protective message. It's just a groove your mind falls into automatically. With habitual resistance, gentle persistence works better than forceful override. You acknowledge the resistance, thank your brain for its input, and proceed anyway. Not with gritted teeth, but with compassion for the fact that your mind is doing what minds do. You're not fighting yourself, you're just choosing to follow through despite the mental chatter.
Then there's misalignment resistance. This is the most important kind to recognize because it's telling you something crucial about design. Misalignment resistance persists even when you're rested, even when you've established the habit, even when you've pushed through multiple times. It's the constant sense that this thing you're trying to make yourself do doesn't quite fit who you actually are. This resistance isn't your enemy, it's your ally. It's trying to protect you from building a life that looks good on paper but feels wrong in practice. It's information that you need to redesign something, maybe the specific behavior, maybe the timing, maybe the deeper goal it's meant to serve. A lot of people waste years pushing through misalignment resistance in service of goals they think they should want. They force themselves to wake early because productive people wake early, even though they're naturally night-oriented. They make themselves pursue prestigious careers that drain them because that's what success looks like externally. They override their genuine inclinations in favor of should-based living. And they wonder why consistency is so hard, why they keep burning out, why achievement feels hollow even when they reach it. The sustainable path requires the courage to question whether what you're trying to be consistent with actually matches who you are. Not who you should be, not who would impress others, not who would make your parents proud, who you actually are in your deepest, most honest assessment. This doesn't mean giving up at the first sign of difficulty. Building anything worthwhile involves challenge. But there's a difference between the growth edge challenge of becoming more fully yourself and the constant strain of trying to be someone you're not. Growth edge challenge energizes even as it stretches you. You might feel nervous or uncertain, but there's an aliveness to it, a sense of moving towards something true. Misalignment strain depletes. It feels like constant self-suppression, like you're wearing clothes that don't fit, like you're betraying something essential about yourself for the sake of an external standard. Learning to distinguish between these is one of the most valuable skills for sustainable consistency, and it requires developing what might be called self-loyalty, a commitment to building a life that's genuinely yours rather than one that looks right from the outside. Self-loyalty doesn't mean self-indulgence. It doesn't mean doing only what's easy or comfortable. It means being honest about your actual values, your genuine capacity, your real constraints, and designing from that truth rather than from fantasy or external expectation.
When you're self-loyal, resistance becomes a valuable signal rather than something to automatically overcome. You can ask, is this resistance protecting me from harm? Is it just habitual noise? Or is it telling me something important about misalignment? Different types of resistance call for different responses. Protective resistance calls for rest or adjustment. Habitual resistance calls for gentle persistence. Misalignment resistance calls for redesign. But all of it calls for something our culture doesn't particularly value: the willingness to slow down, feel what you're feeling, and respond with wisdom rather than force. This brings us to perhaps the most counterintuitive insight about working with resistance. Sometimes the way forward is to stop pushing entirely. When you've been trying to force consistency for weeks or months, when you're exhausted from the constant internal battle, when showing up has become nothing but grim determination, stopping might be the most psychologically intelligent choice. Not stopping forever, not giving up on what matters, but creating deliberate space to step back, release the pressure, and return to connection with why it mattered in the first place. Most people fear that if they stop, they'll never start again, that if they release the pressure, they'll lose all momentum, that taking a break is the beginning of permanent quitting. And sometimes, when the only thing driving you was guilt or external expectation, that fear is justified. When you stop, you realize you never really wanted it in the first place. But if there's genuine desire beneath the resistance, if there's authentic connection to the practice when you strip away all the should and supposed to, then stepping back doesn't lead to permanent stopping, it leads to renewal. You return not because you have to, but because you want to. Not with grim determination, but with remembrance of why it matters. Not from depletion, but from choice. This cycle of engagement, release, and return is natural. It's how humans actually work with long-term commitments. But we've been taught to see any break in the streak as failure, any release of intensity as weakness. So we push and push until we collapse, then feel shame about the collapse, then eventually rebuild, only to repeat the cycle. What if instead you built the cycle into your system? What if you planned for seasons of intensity and seasons of maintenance? What if you gave yourself permission to scale back when life gets heavy, knowing you can scale back up when capacity returns? This isn't inconsistency, it's sustainable pacing. It's the difference between sprinting until you collapse and running at a pace you can maintain for years. The resistance you feel isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's your wisest self trying to protect you from the tyranny of your ambitious self. Sometimes the most consistent thing you can do is rest.
Chapter 5: The Long Game. Consistency measured in days looks very different from consistency measured in decades. What serves you over a week might destroy you over a year. What seems sustainable for a year might need adjustment to last a lifetime. The psychology of consistency shifts dramatically when you extend the timeline. Most people optimize for short-term consistency, maintaining the streak, hitting the target, meeting the commitment. This makes sense because short-term feedback is what you can see and feel immediately. You know whether you showed up today. You can track whether you hit your weekly goal. You can measure monthly progress. But true winning without burning out requires thinking in much longer time frames. It requires optimizing not for this month's perfect streak, but for next decade's cumulative growth. And those two optimization targets often suggest very different strategies. Short-term optimization says never miss, push through resistance, maintain intensity. Long-term optimization says miss strategically when necessary, respect resistance that's protective, vary intensity with life seasons. Short-term consistency makes today's output the priority. Long-term optimization makes sustainable capacity the priority, knowing that capacity maintained across years produces more total output than intensity maintained across months. Short-term optimization fears any break in momentum. Long-term optimization understands that true momentum isn't about daily streaks. It's about directional consistency across time, even with tactical flexibility. This isn't to say short-term consistency doesn't matter. It does. Each day is a vote for identity. Each small win builds self-trust. But when short-term consistency comes at the cost of long-term sustainability, you're making a bad trade. You're sacrificing the campaign for the battle. The long game requires several specific mindset shifts that go against common productivity culture. 1. Releasing attachment to linear progress. We're trained to expect that if we put in consistent effort, we should see consistent results. Input should correlate with output. But that's not how complex systems work, and humans are complex systems. Sometimes you practice consistently for months and see minimal external results. Then suddenly something clicks and you have a breakthrough. The months of no progress weren't wasted. They were building a foundation you couldn't see. The visible breakthrough was made possible by invisible accumulation. Sometimes you make rapid progress, then plateau. The plateau doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means you're consolidating gains, integrating lessons, building capacity at a new level before the next expansion. But if you expect linear progress, plateaus feel like failure. You lose motivation. You might abandon the practice right before the next breakthrough. Understanding natural patterns of growth, periods of rapid expansion, periods of consolidation, periods of apparent regression that are actually reorganization at a deeper level, this frees you from the tyranny of daily metrics.
you can trust the process even when results aren't visible because you understand that invisible work still counts. 2. Building anti-fragility rather than optimization. An optimized system is efficient, but it's also brittle. It works perfectly under ideal conditions and breaks under stress. An anti-fragile system might be less efficient, but it actually gets stronger through challenge and variation. In the context of consistency, optimization might mean designing the perfect routine that maximizes output. Anti-fragility means building a practice flexible enough to survive disrupted schedules, energy fluctuations, life crises, and changing priorities. The optimized approach might generate better results in stable times, but across a lifetime that includes job changes, relocations, relationships, parenthood, health challenges, loss, and all the other variations of human existence, the anti-fragile approach wins because it doesn't break when conditions change. This means building in slack, redundancy, multiple pathways to the same outcome. It means having not just one way to maintain your practice, but several, so that when circumstances eliminate one option, others remain available. It means defining consistency loosely enough that you can maintain it across radical life changes. If your fitness practice can only happen at a specific gym, what happens when you move, travel, or that gym closes? But if your fitness practice is intentional movement daily, and you have multiple ways to fulfill that, gym workouts, home bodyweight exercises, walks, swimming, sports, dance, you're anti-fragile. You can maintain the essence across changing conditions.
3. Valuing identity stability over behavior perfection. This might be the most important long-game insight. Over years and decades, the specific behaviors you do will change. The 30-year-old's fitness routine probably won't work for the 60-year-old's body. The single person's schedule won't fit the parent's reality. The early career intensity won't match late career priorities. If your consistency depends on specific behaviors remaining unchanged, you'll face identity crisis every time life demands adaptation. But if your consistency is rooted in stable identity that can express through different behaviors, I'm someone who takes care of my body, rather than I'm someone who lifts weights 4 times a week, you can adapt behaviors while maintaining identity continuity. This is how people sustain commitments across entire lifetimes. The specific actions flex with circumstances, but the identity remains constant. They're always a person who creates, or moves, or learns, or contributes. How that manifests changes, but who they are stays true. Building this kind of identity-level consistency requires zooming out regularly to see the through line beneath surface changes, asking not just what did I do this week, but who am I becoming across this year, this decade, this life? Recognizing that missing workouts for a month while recovering from injury doesn't make you not an athlete. Taking a season off from creative work while navigating a crisis doesn't make you not creative. Adapting your practice doesn't mean losing your identity. Sometimes it means honoring it more deeply. 4. Understanding that rest is part of the practice, not interruption of it. This might be the hardest shift for people conditioned in productivity culture, where rest is only valuable as recovery for more work. But in the long game, rest isn't just recovery. It's a fundamental part of how sustainable excellence works. It's when integration happens, when lessons sink in, when your system reorganizes at a higher level of complexity. Athletes know this. You don't build strength during the workout, you build it during rest,
when your body repairs and adapts. Push without rest and you get injury and decline, not progress. The rest is where the magic happens. The same is true psychologically. You don't integrate insights while constantly consuming new information. You integrate during quiet reflection. You don't develop wisdom while frantically doing. You develop it while pausing to notice what you've learned. But our culture treats rest as weakness, pause as laziness, any gap in productivity as waste. So people push and push until they break, then feel ashamed about needing to rest, then return too quickly and break again. What if you approached rest as strategically as you approach effort? What if you planned for it, valued it, protected it as fiercely as you protect your productive time? Not as reward for work done, but as essential component of the work itself. This might mean daily rest, actually stopping at the end of your work, creating transition space, allowing your nervous system to settle rather than scrolling through more information until sleep. It might mean weekly rest, a day with genuinely different rhythms where achievement isn't the metric. It might mean seasonal rest, periods where you deliberately scale back commitments, simplify structure, create space for restoration and renewal. Rest built into the system is what prevents burnout. Rest as interruption of the system is what you're forced into when you've pushed too far. One is strategic, the other is collapse. The long game is won by people who understand this deeply enough to value it in practice, not just theory. 5. Developing meta-awareness of your patterns. The longer you maintain any practice, the more you accumulate data about how you work, what conditions support you, what derails you, what your early warning signs of burnout look like, how you respond to different types of stress. Most people don't do anything systematic with this data. They just live through patterns repeatedly without extracting lessons. But people who sustain consistency across decades tend to develop sophisticated self-knowledge. They become students of their own psychology. They notice, I always struggle with consistency in November. So they plan for that, adjust expectations, build in extra support during that time, rather than being surprised when it happens again. They recognize, I lose motivation when I go too long without external feedback. So they build feedback mechanisms into their practice rather than waiting for motivation to mysteriously return. This meta-awareness creates a different relationship with challenges. Instead of, why can't I just be consistent? It's, oh, this is the pattern where my energy dips. I know what to do here. Instead of shame about struggles, there's recognition and skillful response. Developing this awareness requires reflection practices, journaling, regular reviews, conversations with people who know you well, therapy or coaching. Whatever methods help you see your patterns more clearly. It requires humility about the fact that you don't have yourself completely figured out and probably never will. And it requires patience with the learning process. You won't get it right immediately. You'll try things that don't work. You'll misread signals. You'll make the same mistakes multiple times before the lesson really sinks in. That's not failure. It's how learning actually works. The goal isn't perfection, it's gradual improvement in self-understanding that allows gradual improvement in how you design your life. The long game, ultimately, is about becoming increasingly skillful at being yourself. Not a fantasy version, your actual self, with all your quirks and limits and variations. Getting better at working with what you've got, rather than constantly fighting to be different. This is what allows people to win every day without burning out. not because they've transcended human limitation, but because they've learned to work within it so skillfully that it stops feeling like limitation.
Conclusion: the paradox of effortless consistency. We've traveled through architecture and practice, resistance and rhythm, short games and long. We've explored identity and environment, systems and feedback, protection and persistence. All of this serves one simple but profound shift: moving from forced consistency to natural consistency, from willpower-driven showing up to identity-based presence. But here's the paradox you need to understand as you move forward. Effortless consistency isn't actually effortless, at least not at first. It takes tremendous effort to build the conditions that make consistency feel effortless. It takes sustained attention to design architecture that works. It takes patience to start small and build gradually. It takes courage to honor rest and resistance when culture tells you to push through. The effort, though, is front-loaded. You're investing in foundation, in systems, in self-knowledge. You're doing the hard work of becoming rather than the hard work of forcing. And that investment, made wisely over time, creates conditions where showing up stops being a daily negotiation and becomes simply what you do. People who seem to maintain consistency effortlessly aren't coasting. They've just done the foundational work so thoroughly that the daily practice rests on solid ground. They've aligned their environment with their values, their behaviors with their identity, their systems with their reality. They've removed so much unnecessary friction that the path they want to walk is the path of least resistance. You can build this too. Not overnight, not through one perfect system or one powerful realization, but through patient, persistent application of the principles we've explored. Through small votes for identity that accumulate into undeniable pattern. Through environmental design that makes desired behavior easier than undesired. Through systems flexible enough to survive your actual life. Through feedback that informs rather than judges. Through resistance treated as information rather than enemy. The question isn't whether you can be consistent. You've already proven you can be, in dozens of areas where behavior aligns with identity, where environment supports intention, where the practice serves something you genuinely value. The question is whether you can extend that natural consistency into new domains by building the same alignment there. But it requires releasing the belief that consistency is about being stronger, tougher, more disciplined than you currently are. It's not about becoming superhuman. It's about becoming more skillfully human. It requires trading the dramatic narrative of constant self-overcoming for the quieter story of gradual self-understanding. Trading intensity for sustainability. Trading perfection for presence. Trading the sprint for the marathon, except recognizing that the marathon itself is made of nothing but single steps, each one mattering, none requiring heroics. The psychology of consistency, ultimately, is the psychology of self-compassion meeting self-knowledge meeting strategic design. It's understanding that you are a complex system with patterns and needs and limits, and that working with that system produces far better results than fighting it. It's recognizing that winning every day doesn't mean peak performance every day. It means showing up with whatever you have, maintaining contact with what matters, casting votes for identity even when the votes are small. It's accepting that some days the vote is completing a full practice session. Other days it's doing the minimum. Some days it's resting intentionally. All of these count. All of these build the pattern. All of these are consistent with being someone who shows up. The path forward is simpler than you might think, though simple doesn't mean easy. Start with one behavior that matters to you, one practice that serves something you genuinely value, not something you think you should value. Make it small enough that you can do it on your worst day. Design your environment to support it. Connect it to identity rather than outcome. Show up, even badly, even briefly, but show up. Do this until it's automatic, until you've proven to yourself that you can keep your word, until the identity is established. Then, and only then, expand. Add another small practice. Increase the scope of the first. Always building on foundation, never on fantasy. Watch the resistance when it comes. Investigate it. Protective resistance gets honored. Habitual resistance gets gently persisted through. Misalignment resistance gets taken seriously as a signal to redesign. Build in rest, build in flexibility, build in variation. Make your system anti-fragile rather than optimal. Plan for seasons. Trust non-linear progress. Value identity stability over behavioral rigidity. Become a student of your own patterns. Notice what works. Notice what doesn't. Adjust based on data rather than shoulds. Get better at being yourself rather than trying to be someone else.
This is the work. Not glamorous, not dramatic, just patient, persistent, compassionate engagement with the project of building a life that works for the person you actually are. And here's what happens when you do this work. Gradually, without quite noticing when it shifted, consistency stops being hard. Not because you've developed supernatural discipline, but because you've removed the conditions that made it hard. The behavior you want has become normal for you. The identity is established. The environment supports it. The system sustains it. The resistance has been addressed at its root. You still show up on hard days, but showing up isn't torture. It's just what you do, who you are, the natural expression of identity in daily action. This is winning every day without burning out, not through force or willpower or constant self-overcoming, but through alignment, understanding, and design that works with your humanity rather than against it. You already have everything you need to build this. The principles are here. The understanding is available. What remains is application. Patient, persistent, compassionate application across time. Start small. Start now. Start with one vote for the identity you're building, then another, then another. Trust the accumulation. Trust the process. Trust that becoming more skillfully yourself is enough. It is enough. It's more than enough. It's everything.